Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining in. You have joined our new podcast, Bilateral View. This is me, Arup K, Chatterjee, saying a warm welcome to all of you. And with me here is Dr. Rhodora Magan from the Philippines. Bilateral View happens to be a conversation across cultures between two nations and hopefully their representatives in a minor capacity. And I am very keen to hear from Dr. Magan about how it is in the Philippines and how's the weather and how's everything back home, Dr. Magan.
Right. Thank you, Professor Chatterjee, for having me in this podcast. It's an honor to be your co-host. Yes, you're right. The few topics we're going to be having in this podcast is going to be resonating with what's happening in Southeast Asia, for example. So Sherlock Holmes is very much adapted in many cultures out there. I'd like to ask, because I read your study, and this question is very important. Why is there a need for us to talk about Sherlock Holmes in the 21st century?
Well, apart from the fact that Sherlock Holmes has been adapted vigorously of late for 21st century audiences, beginning with a big screen adaptation featuring Robert Downey Jr. And that was followed by another, highly commercially successful and very popular series launched by the BBC featuring Benedict Cumberbatch.
Yes.
In general, I think the trend is catching up all the more because people need good models. We are living in increasingly nuclearized times, and we need good icons all the more because somehow it seems like the old system of family, I think, cohesions has disintegrated somewhat, and that requires all the more for us to see better models on the screen and on the pages of literary fiction, as it were. So Sherlock Holmes,
saying necessary heroes, right?
Yes, and Sherlock Holmes, I dare say, is one of those models, one of those icons that keeps growing in stature. Now, albeit there are some problems that also come with that repackaging of what is originally in 19th century a Victorian character who was born sometime in the 1850s, who lived throughout the Victorian years, well into the Edwardian years. One speculates that Sherlock Holmes, the fictional character, lived, well into the 1920s. So I suppose there are going to be differences in the way we approach the new Sherlock Holmes and vis-a-vis, the canonical Sherlock Holmes that was constructed by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
That's the reason why I like this podcast, because we can freely talk about these people, especially iconic ones like Sherlock Holmes, whose character or whose many characteristics are actually being used by people now to, channel their causes and say campaign for great things. And with that, I'm going to ask you whether or not substance abuse is something that is needing some correction, because these adaptations kind of focus on that.
Yeah, it is a bit, worrying for me why the makers would latch onto that aspect of Sherlock Holmes. Because if you read the canon carefully, the original, which is, I know, a very loaded notion, there is practically no original, so to speak. But still, if you read the canon written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you will find that there's only two instances of what you are terming as substance abuse. So once it is morphine and the other time it is cocaine. To give you an example of his cocaine consumption from the sign of the film, and Dr. Watson asks him, what is it this time, morphine or cocaine? And he famously describes it as a 7% solution. But herein comes the point that Sherlock Holmes, in Arthur Conan Doyle's perspective, is not a substance abuser. He consumes substance, he consumes drugs, not for recreational purposes, not because he's addicted to them, He's addicted to work. He's a workaholic. But he wants to keep his mind at play. Right? He wants to keep operating. And that is why he consumes these things. And he also does that as an intellectual experiment. In the Sign of the Four, where Dr. Watson comes to supposedly admonish him as a medical practitioner, Holmes, turns the tables, and suddenly the shoe is on the other foot, because under the quote-unquote influence of this 7% solution, Holmes is able to deduce the entire ancestry of Dr. Watson's watch, which was an heirloom, by the way, from his father, which passed on to his elder brother. And from the watch, its details, its scratches, Holmes is able to deduce, multiple morally questionable pasts of his Dr. Watson's father and his elder brother. So what we find here is, a kind of a fabulous, almost like a moral precept implicitly being discussed by Arthur Conan Doyle, that on the one hand, substance abuse is not cool. Even though back in the 19th century...
Moral reset.
Yeah, back in the 19th century, it was perfectly legal and not necessarily immoral either. So Holmes would not have been doing anything particularly licentious if he was consuming cocaine or morphine back then. Again, this is not an endorsement of any of these substances in the present era at all. But as historians of literary fiction, we have the right to evaluate a character within his or her context. And Holmes, in his context, is perfectly above the board. But even within that context, he's not abusing these substances. So I was perturbed quite a bit when the makers of the 21st century Holmes adaptations decided to latch on to these aspects. And arguably, these are also the aspects that make the new Holmes even more successful, because like it or not, we are living in the era of TikTok reels and Instagram reels. So whatever is cringe or slightly beneath the board does tend to sell a lot more than the normal things. So the normalization of these substances, it's definitely possible.
Do you find it dangerous? Because I thought that within the popular culture framework, this practice is going to be sustained. You see, we talked about commodification. You talk about Hollywoodization of everything. So do you think this will go on, for some years? And why is this dangerous?
The fact that you are commodifying and you're making at the same time an intellectual man, the icon, the figure of a very, very highly, high functioning intellectual from the Victorian era, more accessible to the audience through the hinge or through the hook of these idiosyncrasies, which are not very moral or not very legal to begin with. Well, I don't think it's dangerous, that would be a strong word, but certainly pernicious, because then it would seem that Holmes is becoming popular for the wrong reasons. Pernicious. Or unpopular for the wrong reasons. Because attached to substance abuse is also this trait of toxic masculinity, which is completely alien to the original Holmes. Holmes was exceedingly well-mannered, not merely in his sartorial appearance. He was impeccably dressed, but he had remarkable etiquette. And it was a cause of chagrin for Watson very often, because he wouldn't be able to match up to Holmes. Now, Holmes was a man of nerves of steel. But that does not mean he was hostile towards members of society. He was not a sociopath, like the BBC adaptation tends to project. And Holmes was exceedingly well-mannered towards women. Whereas both the Robert Downey Jr. version and the Benedict Cumberbatch version, especially the latter, tends to project Holmes as somebody who takes pleasure in being somewhat sociopathic and kind of aggressive towards the female sex. I don't think these are matters that we can find in the original canon at all.
Yeah. You see, these very important information will surely help our audience out there to process this character development of Sherlock Holmes in these adaptations. So I think there's a lot to take in. Why not take a break? And we'll have more after this break. Hello, good evening once again. We're back from the break. So earlier, Professor Chatterjee, you shared how this character of Sherlock is hijacked, by these adaptations. And, there's this mental substance that is wrongly painted in these adaptations. Also, you mentioned how Watson, Dr. Watson, is very influential. I think his character is important to neutralize things. Do you believe that this is the humanizing element in the story?
Well, yes and no, actually. Dr. Watson, as one of my critics while I was writing, all those research articles on Sherlock Holmes. By the way, I've written 5 or 6 peer-reviewed articles and multiple other in the mainstream press. So one of my critics once reminded me helpfully, I should add, that Dr. Watson's presence is vital to the construction of this figure of Sherlock, because aspect of British common law from Victorian England that you need a witness in order to solve your cases, or whatever details you have unearthed about a certain case needs to be presented to one honorable witness who, well, supposedly is a Victorian white man, not orderly. So I think Watson is not merely a narrator, but also a legal responsibility in the oeuvre that represents Sherlock Holmes. But apart from that, I think there is this huge disjuncture between the way Arthur Conan Doyle perceived or conceived the Holmesian world vis-a-vis how the makers have represented Holmes in their adaptations in the 21st century. Because, see, what happens in the adaptations is that what we see is what we believe. And there is no scope for any kind of willing suspension of belief, if I may put it that way. By which I mean, when we view the adaptations, they are so, even though they are surreal, even though the times have been changed, even though the characters have been shifted here and there a bit, the plot lines have been modified, what we see becomes believable or invites us to believe it. Whereas Arthur Conan Doyle's stories were doing something different. Constantly in the stories, you will have this dialogue or dialectic between Holmes and Watson, that Watson gives Holmes a very airy-fairy kind of a representation because Watson is a romantic. And there are actually historical inaccuracies in the stories themselves. So if I may put it this way, that there is meta-historicity and fictitiousness, fictional. It's a meta-fictional world that the Arthur Conan Doyle stories are talking about. That Watson is giving Holmes an inaccurate representation, and Arthur Conan Doyle is giving them both some sort of an inaccurate representation. So this healthy, exchange of belief and disbelief and the room for questioning, I think, disappears in the adaptations. If you know what I mean, and that makes it seem like, well, Dr. Watson is a narrator, all right, but he is probably not as inaccurate as the original Watson was. To give you an example of Dr. Watson's inaccuracy in the canon, Dr. Watson, who's come back from Afghanistan, is supposed to be wounded, somewhere, I think, in his limbs. But Watson himself, the character, forgets where he was wounded. So in one short story, it is somewhere in the subclavian artery. In another short story, it is in his shoulder. In another novel or novella, it is in his legs. So he is somewhat confused, or maybe Doyle is a little bit confused. Now, this is also a problem of serialization, because Doyle was writing these as serials in the Strand magazine. But when we watch the films or the adaptations, we perhaps binge watch them, and definitely if it's a work of cinema of 2 hours, then we watch it at once. So those nuances of storytelling, of narrative problems, or narrative diversity, as it were, that I think gets eroded, and viewers are then left to see Sherlock Holmes, fictional or otherwise, as he is on the screen, and that is what you see is what you get. There is no room for further imagination about what might have been the other aspects of Holmes that were hidden from the public at large.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Chatterjee. So earlier you talked a lot about how India needs to be understood with reference to Sherlock Holmes. Can you share some more references or linkages so that our viewers could better understand the relevance of Indic culture in the creation of the Holmesian universe?
Thank you, Dr. Magan, for that question. I think it's quite the other way around. It's not India that needs to be understood with reference to Sherlock Holmes, but rather Sherlock Holmes who needs to be understood vigorously with reference to India. Because consider it this way: the Indian universe is informing the Holmesian canon in the 19th and the early 20th century. Now, to give you one example, apart from the details that we can get from the short stories, the world of a detective is almost nothing, at least in the 19th century and the 20th century, without poisons, without crimes. So if there's no murder mystery, then the readers don't have something to really latch on to, because that is what really drives the plot. Everybody wants to know who committed the murder. Now, the one of the most important weapons that the criminals in the Holmesian world find to commit their murders are poisons, and these poisons owe a great deal to the Indian subcontinent. So Arthur Conan Doyle was a student of medicine at the University of Edinburgh between 1878 and 1882. And this was also the time that Victorian toxicology was at its peak, and Victorian African toxicology and Victorian Indian toxicology were making great headways. So Victorian anthropology and Victorian tropical medicine and Victorian toxicology were this trinity that was shaping people like Arthur Conan Doyle, who was in turn shaping the Holmesian world. So if we reduce the Indian subcontinent's presence to merely certain proper nouns or merely the plot line in one given novel, and refuse to go into the tiniest things that inspired Arthur Conan Doyle, such as the poisons. There is one instance which I have pointed out in one of my papers, where a very famous African poison, or what Arthur Conan Doyle calls an African poison, was actually an Indian poison. And toxicologists throughout the 20th century and the early 21st century have worked on this problem area, but they could not exactly, pin it down to one poison. But I believe I have landed on it, where I identify the quote-unquote African poison from Arthur Conan Doyle's short story, The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, to an Indian poison. Because I studied the annals of toxicology, and I also made very, educated speculations on what was the material that Arthur Conan Doyle was studying in his days as a student of medicine and afterwards. So Arthur Conan Doyle himself was deeply inspired by India, and if we do not apply the same methods that Sherlock Holmes applied, that is the science of deduction or the art of detection, as Watson later calls it in the canon, to the Holmesian canon itself, then I don't think we are doing justice as literary critics to Arthur Conan Doyle's work and labor.
It's beautiful that you mentioned how Sir Arthur Conan Doyle draws upon India's method of deduction. It sort of tells us all that this inspiration comes from India. And that's the reason why earlier you spoke of intellectual supremacy. Can you talk more about this?
I don't think Arthur Conan Doyle draws from India the method of scientific deduction, but what he draws from India is what he draws from India definitely is a lot of inspiration and a wealth of historical material. And he also draws on Indian spiritual traditions like Buddhism, like the Upanishads, Vedanta. And he's drawing also from theosophists like Helena Blavatsky. Who, by the way, becomes controversial towards the end of her life. But rather than, I think looking at the science of deduction as purely an empirical science, what we need to do is look at it with the kind of skepticism, say, with which we look at, matters of religion, for example, or matters of cultural supremacy. So the same models of skepticism should be applied to any kind of scientific deduction as well, because I don't think Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to separate scientific deduction from the other walks of life. I think in his perception in the Holmesian world, science is very much linked to several other aspects of culture and spirit and the spirit. So the life of the mind is also the life of the spirit for Sherlock Holmes, as I have as I have argued in one of my papers, uh, which is a rather a call to action, I would say, not to make empiricism absolute. Certainly not the absolute scale of determining how good or how wonderful a particular society is. I think it should be seen with a healthy dose of skepticism and equanimity.
Okay. Well, but there is no doubt that Arthur Conan Doyle got so much from the Indic culture, and that moving forward, especially in the 21st century, this can be conveyed to the youngsters out there who are only concerned with action-packed narratives. And more than the action-packed narratives, the visuals, the icons, Cumberbatch, for example. So if there's one thing that we can never, ever emulate from Sherlock Holmes, what could that be?
I think we have sort of touched on this aspect in the initial part of this conversation, but I am no authority on what we should not be emulating from Holmes. But at the same time, I think if you read the original, it would become clearer that Holmes, in the adapted versions, is not the man that Arthur Conan Doyle actually had in mind. And if you have to be a genius, I don't think that requires any kind of hostility towards members of society. I don't think a genius needs to commit substance abuse. I don't think a genius needs to be impolite or indelicate towards women. I think it's perfectly all right for a genius to be monastic, celibate, even a solitudinarian, to live in solitude. But really, I think this concept of the mad genius need not be alienated from society. It can very well live in society and enjoy social life. So if we take the adaptations as any index of who Holmes was, then those are the aspects that I sadly would not endorse. That is, being alienated from society, being aggressive towards your people of, let's say, who are not as good as you in the intellectual game, or who don't seem as good as you, because maybe there are other wonderful aspects to them, and a life of intellect is not the only life to lead. There are many more aspects to life. So
exactly, but at the end of the day, we think that the detective genre has been heavily impacted by Sherlock Holmes and the universe Conan Doyle created. For example, in Southeast Asia, we have a lot of writers emulating Conan Doyle. The very idea of a necessary hero giving justice to whoever deserves justice. I mean, that simple motif is promoted every now and then, even with those adaptations. So what can you say is or can you predict the status of detective genre?
I think it's beyond my purview, to be honest. But what certainly is very clear to me. It is evident that the world where the detective operates is going to change dramatically, and it would become more like a world of virtual crimes, or rather the crimes themselves, no matter their magnitude. Maybe the magnitude would be severer, but the world itself would become virtualized increasingly. So I sense that the distance between the real life and the virtual life will diminish a lot more, and that is to say, it would be a meta-referential world. The detective would be working in the cyberspace, and we would be getting to hear and know about the detective in that very cyberspace. And it's also not unlikely to me that while we consume stories and myths and legends about the cyberspace detective, at that very instant we might be participating ever so unknowingly in we might be complicit, I mean to say, in certain crimes that go beyond our notice. So that is a very creepy, a very eerie scenario, and I hope this prediction does not come true. But there are certain indications that artificial intelligence is really taking over the game of detection. So, well, unfortunate but true, I suppose.
Professor Chatterjee, you wrote a lot about Sherlock Holmes. Your papers would tell volumes of your love for this creation by Conan Doyle. Personally, do you adore the character?
Very much do, and I believe we have the obligation to endorse Sherlock Holmes as he was represented by Arthur Conan Doyle, but not each and every aspect. I think we have the also equally the obligation to enjoy Sherlock Holmes as a fictional character, as somebody who is not really out there, and we do not need to model ourselves on Holmes unless we ourselves really want to. And if we really want to think seriously about adopting or adapting certain Holmesian traits in ourselves, then maybe we should look more at his democratic and egalitarian side, which are also equally true of Holmes, just like his intellectual side.
I love that, the egalitarian side too. Much has been said. We've covered much tonight. And you see, how I wish there could be much time to talk about this, but we have to say goodbye to our audience because they have to digest everything you've said. And these are so heavy matters to begin with. So, Professor Chatterjee, I hope you enjoyed our conversation tonight.
Well, it was a wonderful conversation, Dr. Magan. I am very, very pleasantly surprised at the way this conversation went. It was totally unexpected. I think the audience has the right to know that we did not script any of this. It was entirely impromptu and purely a work of love that we wanted to put out there for all of you. Well, I certainly found it an honor and a huge pleasure to converse with you, Dr. Magan, and I'm sure our audience must have liked it as much as I did and we did. And I look forward to having many more such conversations with you on Bilateral View.
Right. Like you said at the beginning, Bilateral View is going to be conversations about two sides or even beyond the two sides, the multifarious levels out there. And hopefully our audiences will be engaged along the way as they discover interesting ideas, very exquisite takes on these beautiful, beautiful matters like Sherlock Holmes and many more. So I think we have to say goodbye, Professor Chatterjee, to our audience. And because I'm a Cebuana, I would say maayong gabi natong tanan.
Namaste to everybody.
Bye-bye. Have a great day.